Have you ever wondered how women survived one of history's most dangerous cultural movements while everyone around them was falling victim to a deadly addiction that claimed thousands of lives? Well, the answer isn't what most people think. Instead of simply becoming victims themselves, many Bohemian women in 1920s Paris developed sophisticated survival strategies that would make modern crisis management experts look like amateurs. So in this soothing journey through one of history's darkest chapters, I'm going to reveal how these remarkable women navigated the treacherous world of Parisian café culture during the heroin epidemic that swept through the artistic community like wildfire. This incredible story spans years of desperate innovation, underground networks, and survival tactics that most historians have completely overlooked. What I'm going to do is walk you through their extraordinary methods for staying alive in a world that seemed designed to destroy them. And by the end of this series, you'll understand exactly how they managed to not just survive, but create lasting change that protected countless others. But first, let me paint you a picture of just how deadly this world really was. The year was 1923, and Paris was experiencing what appeared to be a golden age of artistic expression. The city sparkled with creative energy as writers, painters, and musicians from around the world flocked to its famous cafes and salons. But beneath this glittering surface lurked a poison that was systematically destroying the very people who made this cultural renaissance possible. Heroine had arrived in the Bohemian quarters of Montmartre and Montparnasse like a plague wrapped in silk ribbons. What started as occasional experimentation among a few adventurous artists quickly spiraled into an epidemic that would claim the lives of some of the most promising creative minds of the generation. The drug moved through artistic circles with terrifying efficiency, spread by dealers who understood exactly how to exploit the psychological vulnerabilities of people seeking authentic artistic experience. The cafes that had once been sanctuaries for intellectual discourse and creative collaboration were transformed into something far more sinister. Establishments like Café de la Rotonde and Le Dôme maintained their elegant facades, but regular patrons knew that certain conversations, certain gestures, certain requests could open doors to experiences that promised artistic transcendence, but delivered only destruction. Young women arriving in Paris with dreams of becoming part of the avant-garde movement found themselves navigating a landscape where the line between artistic sophistication and deadly addiction had been deliberately obscured. They came seeking inspiration, community, and the chance to participate in what seemed like the most exciting cultural moment in human history. Instead, they encountered predators who had learned to weaponize creativity itself. But here's what makes this story truly remarkable. While thousands of men succumbed to the heroin epidemic, becoming casualties of their own artistic ambitions, many women developed an entirely different response to these dangers. They didn't simply avoid the problem or become victims themselves. Instead, they created something unprecedented in the history of urban survival. These women, many of whom have been forgotten by conventional historical accounts, established underground networks that functioned as early warning systems, support groups, and rescue operations all rolled into one. They developed coded languages that allowed them to communicate safely about dangers in their environment. They created alternative social spaces that provided the intellectual stimulation and artistic community that people craved without the deadly risks that characterized mainstream Bohemian culture. Most importantly, they learned to read the subtle signs that indicated when someone was being targeted for recruitment into the drug culture that was consuming their community. This wasn't paranoia or feminine intuition. This was systematic intelligence gathering conducted by women who understood that their survival depended on staying several steps ahead of predators who had turned artistic culture into a hunting ground. Marie Dubois exemplified this new breed of Bohemian survivor. She had arrived in Paris from Lyon in 1922 with a modest inheritance and genuine talent as a painter. Like thousands of other young women, she was drawn to the city's reputation for artistic freedom and intellectual sophistication. But unlike many of her contemporaries, Marie possessed an analytical mind that allowed her to observe patterns that others missed or ignored. Within weeks of arriving in Montparnasse, Marie noticed that certain cafes had regular customers who seemed to follow predictable routines. These individuals would arrive at specific times, sit at particular tables, and engage in conversations that followed subtle but consistent patterns. More importantly, she observed that young artists who began associating with these regular customers often underwent dramatic personality changes within a matter of months. The changes weren't simply artistic evolution or the natural result of exposure to new ideas. These were systematic transformations that followed eerily similar trajectories. Promising painters would begin producing work that became increasingly erratic and desperate. Talented writers would start missing deadlines and abandoning projects they had previously been passionate about. Musicians would show up to performances unprepared or fail to appear at all. Marie began documenting these patterns in a journal that she kept hidden in her studio apartment. She recorded names, dates, locations, and behavioral changes with the precision of a scientist conducting research. What she discovered was that the artistic community she had hoped to join was actually being systematically harvested by individuals who understood how to exploit creative ambition for criminal purposes. But Marie's most important discovery was that she wasn't alone in her observations. Other women throughout the artistic quarter were conducting their own informal investigations into the strange changes they were witnessing in their communities. They were asking the same questions, noticing the same patterns, and reaching similar conclusions about the dangers that surrounded them. The breakthrough came when Marie encountered Isabelle Moreau at a small gallery opening in the spring of 1923. Isabelle was a journalist who had come to Paris to write about the cultural Renaissance, but had instead become fascinated by the darker currents she sensed beneath the surface of Bohemian life. During a seemingly casual conversation about art and creativity, both women realized they were observing the same phenomena from different perspectives. Their collaboration marked the beginning of what would become known among survivors as the Sisterhood of Shadows. This wasn't an official organization with formal membership or written rules. Instead, it was a loose network of women who shared information, provided mutual protection, and developed strategies for maintaining their artistic aspirations without falling victim to the predators who were systematically targeting their community. The sisterhood operated according to principles that were both simple and sophisticated. Members learned to identify the warning signs that indicated someone was being groomed for recruitment into drug culture. They developed communication methods that allowed them to share information about dangerous individuals and locations without attracting attention from the very people they were trying to avoid. Most importantly, they created alternative social spaces that provided the intellectual stimulation and creative collaboration that drew people to Bohemian culture in the first place. These spaces were carefully designed to be invisible to the criminal networks that had infiltrated mainstream artistic venues, but accessible to women who needed safe alternatives to the increasingly dangerous cafe culture. The Sisterhood's approach to survival was based on 3 core strategies that would prove remarkably effective over the coming years. First, they prioritized information gathering and analysis over confrontation or direct opposition. Rather than trying to fight the drug dealers and predators who were exploiting their community, they focused on understanding how these criminal operations functioned so they could avoid becoming victims themselves. Second, they emphasized collective action over individual heroism. While many men in the artistic community believed they could outwit or outlast the dangers around them through personal strength or superior intelligence, the women in the sisterhood understood that survival required cooperation and mutual support. They shared resources, provided backup for each other during potentially dangerous situations, and created accountability systems that helped members avoid taking unnecessary risks. Third, they maintained their artistic integrity while adapting their social practices to address contemporary threats. The sisterhood members refused to abandon their creative aspirations or retreat from Parisian cultural life entirely. Instead, they found ways to pursue their artistic goals while minimizing their exposure to the criminal elements that had infected mainstream Bohemian society. These strategies required remarkable discipline and intelligence to implement effectively. Members had to learn to read social situations with extraordinary sensitivity, distinguishing between genuine artistic gatherings and events that had been designed to facilitate criminal recruitment. They had to develop the ability to maintain normal social relationships while constantly evaluating the trustworthiness and motivations of everyone they encountered. Perhaps most challenging of all, they had to resist the constant pressure to prove their artistic authenticity by participating in activities that they knew were dangerous. The heroin epidemic had created a toxic culture where drug use was increasingly viewed as evidence of serious artistic commitment. Refusing to participate in this culture required not just physical courage, but the psychological strength to maintain confidence in one's own artistic vision, despite social pressure and peer judgment. The women who succeeded in developing these survival skills discovered that their approach to bohemian life was not just safer than the mainstream alternative, but actually more conducive to genuine artistic development by avoiding the chemical dependencies that were destroying so many of their male contemporaries. They maintained the mental clarity and emotional stability necessary for sustained creative work. By creating supportive communities that prioritized mutual assistance over competitive individualism, they established working relationships that enhanced rather than undermined their artistic productivity. And by maintaining critical distance from the most fashionable artistic trends, they were able to develop more authentic and personal creative voices that weren't distorted by the need to conform to externally imposed standards of artistic legitimacy. The success of these survival strategies would prove crucial not just for the individual women who developed them, but for the broader artistic community that was being devastated by the heroin epidemic. As the crisis deepened and the death toll mounted, the alternative networks and social practices created by the Sisterhood of Shadows would become increasingly important for anyone who wanted to maintain their artistic aspirations without risking their lives. But developing these survival strategies was only the first phase of what would become a much larger and more ambitious project. The women who had learned to protect themselves from the immediate dangers of the heroin epidemic would soon discover that their skills and networks could be used for far more than personal survival. As the winter of 1923 gave way to spring, the women of the Sisterhood began to realize that their survival network had evolved into something far more powerful than a simple self-protection system. What had started as informal information sharing between a handful of observant women had grown into a sophisticated intelligence operation that spanned multiple neighborhoods and reached into every level of Parisian artistic society. The transformation happened gradually, almost imperceptibly at first. Members who had initially focused on protecting themselves began noticing opportunities to help others, who seemed to be walking blindly into danger. A young sculptor from Germany showing too much interest in the wrong cafe. An American writer being courted by individuals whose true motives were clearly predatory. A musician whose sudden personality changes suggested recruitment into the very networks the Sisterhood had learned to avoid. What started as occasional warnings to vulnerable individuals evolved into systematic intervention efforts that required increasingly sophisticated planning and coordination. The women discovered that effective rescue operations demanded not just good intentions, but detailed knowledge of how criminal recruitment actually functioned in practice. Isabelle Moreau's journalistic background proved invaluable during this transition. Her training in research and investigation allowed her to map the connections between seemingly unrelated individuals and events, revealing patterns that would have remained invisible to less systematic observers. She began treating the heroin epidemic like a story she was investigating, following leads, conducting interviews, and documenting evidence with professional thoroughness. What Isabelle discovered was that the criminal networks exploiting Bohemian culture were far more organized and sophisticated than anyone had previously understood. The dealers and recruiters weren't simply opportunistic predators taking advantage of vulnerable individuals. They were part of coordinated operations that used detailed intelligence about their targets' psychological profiles, financial situations, and social connections to maximize their success rates. These operations had developed recruitment protocols that were specifically designed to exploit the particular vulnerabilities of artistic personalities. They understood that creative individuals often struggled with self-doubt, financial insecurity, and desperate hunger for authentic experience that could be systematically manipulated by skilled operators who knew exactly which emotional buttons to push. More disturbing was Isabel's discovery that the criminal networks had infiltrated legitimate artistic institutions throughout Paris. Gallery owners, cafe proprietors, salon hosts, and even some established artists were either directly involved in drug distribution or had been compromised through addiction, financial pressure, or blackmail. This meant that virtually every venue where artistic activity took place was potentially dangerous for young people seeking to establish themselves in Bohemian society. Armed with this intelligence, the Sisterhood began developing intervention strategies that addressed the sophisticated nature of the threats they were confronting. Simple warnings about avoiding certain locations or individuals weren't sufficient when the entire cultural infrastructure had been systematically compromised. They needed approaches that could compete with professional recruitment operations that had unlimited resources and years of experience manipulating artistic ambitions. The solution they developed was both elegant and revolutionary. Instead of trying to convince vulnerable individuals to avoid Bohemian culture entirely, which was usually ineffective and often counterproductive, the Sisterhood created alternative pathways into artistic society that bypassed the most dangerous elements while still providing genuine cultural experiences. These alternative pathways required the establishment of what amounted to a parallel artistic infrastructure. The women identified galleries, cafes, salons, and performance venues that were either completely clean of criminal influence or could be made safe through careful management and strategic intervention. They cultivated relationships with artists, writers, and musicians who were committed to maintaining drug-free creative environments. Most importantly, they began hosting their own cultural events that provided the intellectual stimulation and social connections that drew people to Bohemian culture in the first place. These gatherings were carefully designed to be indistinguishable from mainstream artistic events to casual observers, but incorporated subtle security measures that prevented infiltration by criminal recruiters. The challenge of creating these alternative cultural spaces was enormous. The women had to develop expertise in event planning, security management, and cultural programming while maintaining their own artistic careers and avoiding detection by the criminal networks they were working to circumvent. They needed to create environments that felt spontaneous and authentic while actually being carefully controlled and monitored. Marie Dubois emerged as a master of this delicate balancing act. Her painter's eye for detail and composition translated surprisingly well to the complex logistics of managing social environments. She learned to read the subtle dynamics that indicated when gatherings were developing in healthy versus dangerous directions, and developed techniques for guiding conversations and activities toward productive outcomes. Marie's studio became one of the first fully secure artistic venues in Montparnasse. She hosted weekly salons that attracted serious painters, writers, and musicians who were seeking alternatives to the increasingly dangerous mainstream Bohemian scene. These gatherings provided everything that people valued about cafe culture: intellectual debate, creative collaboration, exposure to new ideas, but without the predatory elements that had made traditional venues so treacherous. The success of Marie's salon model led to rapid expansion throughout the artistic quarter. Other Sisterhood members began hosting similar gatherings in their own spaces, each adapted to the specific interests and needs of different artistic communities. Isabel organized discussion groups for writers and journalists. Other members created venues for musicians, theatre artists, and visual artists who needed safe spaces to develop their work and build professional relationships. Within months, This alternative cultural infrastructure had grown large enough to support hundreds of artists who were seeking authentic Bohemian experiences without the life-threatening risks that characterized mainstream venues. The parallel system provided newcomers to Paris with immediate access to genuine artistic communities that could nurture their development without exposing them to systematic exploitation. But the sisterhood's most remarkable innovation was the development of what they called protective recruitment. Having studied how criminal networks identified and cultivated vulnerable targets, they created their own recruitment system designed to identify and protect individuals who were at high risk of victimization. This protective recruitment operated through networks of women who were strategically positioned throughout Paris to identify newly arrived artists, writers, and musicians who fit the profiles that criminal recruiters typically targeted. These spotters would approach vulnerable individuals before criminal operators had a chance to make contact, offering them immediate access to safe artistic communities and comprehensive orientation about the realities of Parisian Bohemian culture. The orientation process was crucial to the success of protective recruitment. Rather than simply warning people about dangers, which often made them more curious about forbidden experiences, the sisterhood developed educational programs that helped newcomers understand how criminal exploitation actually functioned and why it was incompatible with genuine artistic development. These educational programs were based on real case studies of individuals who had been victimized by drug recruiters. The women had documented dozens of stories that illustrated how seemingly sophisticated criminal operators actually preyed on basic human needs for acceptance, community, and artistic validation. By understanding these manipulation techniques, newcomers could recognize and resist recruitment attempts before they became emotionally invested in relationships with predatory individuals. The protective recruitment system also provided practical support that addressed the underlying vulnerabilities that made people susceptible to criminal manipulation in the first place. Financial assistance for artists struggling to establish themselves economically, housing referrals that helped people avoid neighborhoods where criminal recruitment was most intensive, professional networking that connected talented individuals with legitimate opportunities for artistic development and career advancement. Perhaps most importantly, the system provided immediate social integration into supportive artistic communities that satisfied the human needs that criminal recruiters typically exploited. People who had access to genuine friendship, intellectual stimulation, and creative collaboration were much less likely to be attracted by the artificial alternatives offered by drug dealers and their associates. The success of protective recruitment created a virtuous cycle that strengthened the entire alternative cultural infrastructure. Each person who was successfully integrated into safe artistic communities became a potential resource for protecting others who might be vulnerable to criminal exploitation. The network grew organically as grateful recipients of assistance became active participants in helping subsequent newcomers navigate the dangers of Parisian Bohemian society. By the autumn of 1924, the Sisterhood of Shadows had evolved from a small group of women focused on personal survival into a comprehensive social service organization that was successfully competing with criminal networks for influence over artistic communities throughout Paris. Their alternative infrastructure was providing safe, authentic cultural experiences for hundreds of artists, while simultaneously disrupting the recruitment pipelines that fed the heroin epidemic. But success brought new challenges that would test the women's adaptability and resolve. As their operations expanded and became more visible, they attracted attention from the very criminal networks they had been working to circumvent. The dealers and recruiters who had been profiting from the exploitation of artistic communities began to recognize that their business model was being systematically undermined by organized opposition. The response from criminal networks was swift and sophisticated, revealing the true scope and resources of the organizations that had been preying on Bohemian culture. Rather than simply trying to shut down alternative venues or intimidate individual women, the criminal operators launched comprehensive campaigns designed to discredit and destroy the entire sisterhood infrastructure. These campaigns combined direct intimidation with subtle propaganda efforts that were designed to turn artistic communities against the women who were trying to protect them. Criminal operators spread rumors that the Sisterhood was actually a conservative organization trying to suppress authentic Bohemian culture. They suggested that the alternative venues were boring and restrictive compared to the exciting experiences available through traditional channels. Most insidiously, they began recruiting individuals who had been helped by the Sisterhood to serve as informants and saboteurs within the alternative cultural infrastructure. These recruited agents would attend Sisterhood events, gather intelligence about operations and personnel, and create disruptions that made safe venues appear unreliable or unwelcoming to potential participants. The criminal counteroffensive forced the women to develop new levels of operational security while maintaining the open, welcoming atmosphere that made their cultural programs attractive to artists seeking authentic Bohemian experiences. This balancing act required skills that none of them had anticipated needing when they first began sharing information about dangerous individuals and locations. The women had to become experts in counterintelligence while preserving the spontaneous creativity that defined genuine artistic culture. Marie Dubois found herself studying the same recruitment and manipulation techniques that criminal operators used, but applying them in reverse to identify infiltrators and protect her salon from sabotage attempts. The process of screening potential attendees without destroying the welcoming atmosphere that made her gatherings successful required extraordinary social intelligence. Marie developed what she called the 3-conversation test. New visitors would be engaged in seemingly casual discussions about their artistic background, their reasons for coming to Paris, and their connections within the Bohemian community. These conversations, conducted by different Sisterhood members throughout the evening, would reveal inconsistencies that suggested hidden motives or deliberate deception. But the screening process had to be invisible to legitimate participants who were seeking authentic artistic experiences. Marie learned to weave security checks into natural social interactions, using her painter's training in observation and composition to read body language, vocal patterns, and social dynamics that might indicate when someone was playing a role, rather than expressing genuine personality. The challenge was complicated by the fact that many legitimate artists were naturally eccentric, secretive, or emotionally unstable in ways that could easily be mistaken for signs of criminal involvement. Marie had to develop increasingly sophisticated techniques for distinguishing between authentic artistic temperament and the calculated performances of professional infiltrators. Isabelle Moreau's journalistic skills proved essential for developing these counterintelligence capabilities. Her experience in conducting interviews and evaluating source credibility translated directly to the challenge of identifying potential threats within artistic communities. She created training programs that taught other Sisterhood members how to conduct effective security screenings without compromising the open atmosphere that made their venues attractive to genuine artists. The training programs were disguised as workshops on social skills and networking techniques for artists. Participants learned how to ask probing questions that revealed important information while appearing to make casual conversation. They studied techniques for reading nonverbal communication that could indicate when someone was being deliberately deceptive. Most importantly, they learned to trust their instincts when something felt wrong about a person or situation, even if they couldn't immediately articulate what was triggering their concerns. These security measures proved their worth within weeks of implementation. Multiple infiltration attempts were detected and neutralized before they could cause significant damage to Sisterhood operations criminal agents who had expected to easily penetrate alternative cultural venues, found themselves exposed and excluded before they could gather useful intelligence or recruit new victims. The success of these defensive measures allowed the Sisterhood to expand their operations into new areas that required even greater security consciousness. They began developing what they called extraction protocols for helping individuals who had already become involved with criminal networks but wanted to escape before their situations became terminal. Extraction operations were far more dangerous and complex than protective recruitment. People who had been drawn into drug culture were often psychologically dependent on their criminal contacts, financially indebted to dealers, or compromised by activities they had been pressured to participate in. Simple offers of alternative social opportunities were rarely sufficient to overcome these complex forms of bondage. The women had to develop therapeutic approaches that could address the psychological manipulation that kept people trapped in destructive relationships. They studied the techniques that criminal recruiters used to create emotional dependency and developed counter-strategies that could help victims recognize and overcome their conditioning. Louise Girard emerged as the sisterhood's most skilled extraction specialist. Her background as a nurse had given her experience in managing medical crises and understanding human psychology under extreme stress. She adapted these skills to help individuals who were struggling to break free from criminal networks that had systematically undermined their ability to make independent decisions. Louise's approach to extraction was based on gradual relationship building that provided victims with emotional support and practical assistance, while they slowly developed the strength to challenge their existing dependencies. She understood that people who had been systematically manipulated often lost confidence in their own judgment and needed extended periods of guided support before they could function independently. The extraction process typically began with informal contact through mutual friends or chance encounters at sisterhood events. Louise would identify individuals who seemed to be struggling with their involvement in criminal networks, often recognizing signs of distress that were invisible to casual observers but obvious to someone with her training in human psychology. Initial conversations were carefully designed to plant seeds of doubt about the relationships and activities that were keeping victims trapped in dangerous situations. Rather than directly confronting criminal involvement, which usually triggered defensive reactions, Louise would ask gentle questions that encourage people to examine their experiences and consider whether their current situations were actually serving their long-term interests. The process required extraordinary patience and psychological insight. Many victims had been conditioned to view any criticism of their criminal associates as evidence of jealousy or misunderstanding. They often needed months of gentle questioning and supportive interaction before they could acknowledge that they were being exploited rather than helped by the people they had come to depend on. Louise's most challenging cases involved individuals whose criminal involvement had progressed to the point where they were actively participating in recruiting new victims. These people faced not just personal addiction and psychological manipulation, but also potential legal consequences if their criminal activities were discovered by authorities. Fear of prosecution often kept them trapped in situations they desperately wanted to escape. The sisterhood developed specialized protocols for these complex cases that combined psychological support with practical assistance in avoiding legal consequences. They established connections with sympathetic lawyers who could provide confidential advice about legal risks and potential immunity opportunities. They created safe houses where people could stay while they detoxed from drugs and rebuilt their psychological independence from criminal networks. Most importantly, they developed reintegration programs that helped former victims rebuild their artistic careers and social relationships after escaping from criminal involvement. Many people who had been exploited by drug networks found that their reputations within artistic communities had been severely damaged, making it difficult to pursue the creative aspirations that had originally brought them to Paris. The reintegration programs provided both practical support and social rehabilitation that addressed these challenges comprehensively. Former victims received financial assistance, professional networking, and access to alternative cultural venues where they could rebuild their artistic relationships without stigma or suspicion. They were paired with mentors who had successfully navigated similar challenges and could provide guidance about reconstructing their lives and careers. The success of extraction and reintegration operations created powerful testimonials that enhanced the sisterhood's credibility within artistic communities throughout Paris. Former victims who had successfully escaped criminal networks became some of the most effective advocates for alternative cultural infrastructure, provide incredible evidence that the sisterhood's approach actually worked in practice. These testimonials were particularly valuable because they came from people who had direct experience with both criminal networks and sisterhood alternatives. They could speak knowledgeably about the differences between genuine artistic community and the artificial substitutes offered by drug dealers and their associates. Their stories provided compelling evidence that criminal involvement was incompatible with authentic artistic development. By the spring of 1925, the sisterhood had developed capabilities that extended far beyond their original focus on personal survival. They were operating a comprehensive alternative to criminal-controlled Bohemian culture that included safe venues, protective recruitment, extraction services, and reintegration programs. Their network had grown to include hundreds of active members and was successfully serving thousands of artists throughout Paris. But perhaps their most significant achievement was the creation of cultural institutions that could function independently of the charismatic leadership that had originally established them. Marie Dubois and Isabelle Moreau had built systems and trained personnel that could continue operating even if the founders were removed or incapacitated. The sisterhood had evolved from a collection of extraordinary individuals into a sustainable organization that could maintain its mission over extended periods. This institutional development proved crucial as criminal networks intensified their efforts to destroy alternative cultural infrastructure through increasingly sophisticated and aggressive tactics. The operators, who had been profiting from the exploitation of artistic communities, recognized that the sisterhood represented an existential threat to their business model that required decisive action to eliminate. The escalation began with systematic harassment campaigns designed to make sisterhood venues unwelcoming or unsafe for their intended audiences. Criminal operatives would attend alternative cultural events and create disturbances that disrupted programming and made participants uncomfortable. They spread malicious gossip about sisterhood leaders and attempted to damage their reputations within broader artistic communities. When harassment proved insufficient to shut down alternative venues, criminal networks escalated to direct intimidation that targeted individual women who were leading sisterhood operations. Marie Dubois began receiving anonymous threats that promised serious consequences if she continued hosting salon gatherings. Isabelle Moreau found her apartment broken into and her research materials vandalized. Other sisterhood leaders reported similar experiences that seemed designed to create fear and discourage continued resistance to criminal control of Bohemian culture. The intimidation campaigns revealed the true nature of the forces that the women had been confronting. What had initially appeared to be disorganized criminal opportunism was actually systematic economic exploitation that generated enormous profits for organized networks with resources and capabilities that extended far beyond simple drug dealing. The criminal operators who controlled heroin distribution had invested heavily in establishing their dominance over Parisian artistic communities. They viewed Bohemian culture not just as a market for their products, but as a recruitment ground for expanding their operations into new territories and social circles. The sisterhood's success in creating alternatives to criminal-controlled venues threatened to undermine years of investment and strategic planning. The women's response to escalating intimidation demonstrated the maturity and sophistication that their organization had developed during its evolution from informal survival network to comprehensive social service institution. Rather than responding with fear or abandoning their operations, they adapted their security measures and developed new strategies for maintaining their mission despite increased external pressure. The first priority was protecting individual members who had been targeted by intimidation campaigns. The sisterhood established buddy systems that ensured no one attended potentially dangerous events or traveled through risky areas alone. They created communication protocols that allowed members to check in regularly and request assistance if they encountered threats or suspicious situations. More importantly, they developed collective response strategies that distributed risk among multiple individuals rather than concentrating vulnerability in a few visible leaders. Marie Dubois began rotating hosting responsibilities among different members so that no single venue or individual became too attractive a target for criminal retaliation. Isabelle Moreau shared her research and intelligence gathering responsibilities with other members who could continue investigations if she was forced to suspend her activities. The sisterhood also began documenting criminal intimidation efforts with the same systematic thoroughness they had previously applied to understanding recruitment and manipulation techniques. They maintained detailed records of threats, harassment incidents, and suspicious activities that could potentially be used as evidence if legal intervention became necessary. But the women understood that their ultimate security depended not on defensive measures, but on continuing to expand their positive impact within artistic communities. The more successful they became at providing genuine alternatives to criminal-controlled venues, the more support they would receive from artists who valued what they were creating. This understanding led to an acceleration of expansion efforts that brought sisterhood services to new neighborhoods and artistic communities throughout Paris. They established satellite operations in areas that had previously been completely dominated by criminal networks, providing safe alternatives for artists who had been forced to choose between dangerous venues and social isolation. The expansion required enormous coordination and resource management that tested every organizational capability the women had developed. Each new venue needed appropriate security screening, reliable programming, and integration with existing support services. Personnel had to be recruited, trained, and deployed to areas where they might face significant personal risk from criminal operators who viewed their presence as territorial invasion. The logistics of managing multiple venues while maintaining security and quality standards pushed the sisterhood to develop new levels of operational sophistication. They created standardized protocols for establishing new locations, training programs for preparing members to manage complex operations, and communication systems that allowed coordination between venues separated by significant distances. Most challenging was the need to maintain the authentic artistic atmosphere that made their venues attractive while implementing security measures that could protect against increasingly sophisticated criminal infiltration attempts. The balance between openness and security required constant adjustment as threats evolved, and criminal operators developed new tactics for attacking alternative cultural infrastructure. The winter of 1925 brought new challenges that would test every innovation the sisterhood had developed during their remarkable transformation from survival network to cultural institution. As snow blanketed the cobblestone streets of Montparnasse and Montmartre, the women discovered that their success in disrupting criminal recruitment had triggered a response far more coordinated and dangerous than anything they had previously encountered. The escalation began subtly, almost imperceptibly at first. Louise Girard noticed that several individuals she had successfully extracted from criminal networks were suddenly disappearing from sisterhood venues without explanation. These weren't gradual departures or natural transitions to other activities. People who had been regular participants in alternative cultural programming would simply vanish overnight, leaving behind abandoned studio apartments and unpaid debts that suggested hasty, unplanned departures. When Louise attempted to investigate these disappearances, she discovered that the missing individuals had left behind carefully crafted cover stories that made their departures appear voluntary and normal. Friends received letters explaining sudden family emergencies or unexpected career opportunities that required immediate relocation to other cities. Landlords were paid several months in advance with instructions to hold personal belongings until further notice. The sophistication of these cover stories initially convinced even experienced sisterhood members that the departures were legitimate. But Louise's nursing background had taught her to look for patterns that others might miss, and she began noticing subtle inconsistencies that suggested deliberate deception rather than genuine emergencies. The missing individuals shared certain characteristics that seemed too coincidental to be random. They were all people who had possessed detailed knowledge about criminal network operations before their extraction. They had all been successfully integrated into sisterhood alternatives and had become vocal advocates for rejecting involvement with drug dealers and their associates. Most importantly, They were all individuals whose testimonials had been particularly effective at convincing other potential victims to avoid criminal recruitment. Isabel Moreau's investigation confirmed Louise's suspicions and revealed the true scope of what they were confronting. The criminal networks hadn't simply been targeting random sisterhood members for intimidation. They had been conducting systematic intelligence operations designed to identify and eliminate the most effective advocates for alternative cultural infrastructure. The missing individuals hadn't disappeared voluntarily. They had been kidnapped by criminal operatives who understood that removing successful extraction cases would undermine the credibility of sisterhood operations while simultaneously eliminating sources of damaging information about criminal recruitment techniques. This revelation transformed the women's understanding of their situation. They weren't simply providing alternative cultural venues that competed with criminal-controlled establishments. They were engaged in what amounted to warfare against organized networks that possessed resources, intelligence capabilities, and operational sophistication that far exceeded anything they had initially imagined. The criminal networks had treated the sisterhood as a business problem that could be solved through appropriate application of pressure and resources. When harassment and intimidation proved insufficient to shut down alternative venues, they had escalated to direct action that eliminated key personnel while maintaining plausible deniability about their involvement. Marie Dubois convened an emergency meeting of senior sisterhood members to address the kidnapping crisis and develop appropriate responses. The gathering took place in a small church basement that had been secured through connections with sympathetic clergy who understood the importance of supporting artists seeking alternatives to dangerous Bohemian culture. The discussion that followed revealed both the maturity that the organization had developed and the challenges that would test their resolve in unprecedented ways. The women had to decide whether to continue operations despite escalating criminal retaliation, or suspend activities until they could develop adequate defenses against professional kidnapping operations. Some members argued for temporary retreat that would preserve existing personnel while allowing time to develop new security capabilities. Others insisted that suspending operations would represent victory for criminal networks and abandonment of vulnerable artists who depended on sisterhood services for their safety and survival. The debate continued through the night as the women wrestled with questions that had no clear answers. How could they protect their members from professional criminal organizations while maintaining the open, welcoming atmosphere that made their cultural programming effective? How could they develop security capabilities sufficient to deter kidnapping operations without transforming their organization into something that resembled the very networks they were opposing? Marie emerged as the voice of determined resistance during these discussions. Her artist's perspective provided clarity about what was ultimately at stake in their confrontation with criminal exploitation of Bohemian culture. The alternative infrastructure they had created wasn't just providing safer venues for artistic activities, they were preserving the possibility of authentic creative culture that could exist independently of criminal manipulation. If they abandoned their operations in response to criminal intimidation, they would be conceding that artistic communities could only exist under conditions acceptable to organized networks that profited from exploitation and destruction. The kidnappings were designed not just to eliminate specific individuals, but to demonstrate that resistance to criminal control was futile and dangerous. Marie's analysis convinced the assembled women that retreat would represent not just tactical defeat, but strategic surrender that would doom future generations of artists to systematic exploitation. They had developed capabilities and knowledge that could protect countless individuals from victimization, but only if they possessed the courage to continue operating despite personal risks. The decision to maintain operations despite kidnapping threats required the sisterhood to develop entirely new categories of security measures that went far beyond anything they had previously implemented. They needed capabilities for preventing kidnappings, responding to kidnapping attempts, and potentially rescuing members who had been abducted by criminal operatives. Louise Girard volunteered to lead the development of these enhanced security protocols. drawing on her medical training and her experience with extraction operations. She understood that preventing kidnappings required detailed intelligence about criminal operational methods and the ability to recognize warning signs that might indicate when members were being targeted for abduction. The intelligence-gathering effort revealed that criminal kidnapping operations followed predictable patterns that could be disrupted through appropriate countermeasures. The networks typically conducted extensive surveillance of potential targets before attempting abductions, gathering information about daily routines, social relationships, and security practices that could be exploited during kidnapping attempts. Armed with this knowledge, Louise developed what she called defensive mobility protocols that made sisterhood members much more difficult targets for criminal surveillance and abduction operations. Members learned to vary their daily routines in unpredictable ways that prevented criminal operatives from establishing reliable patterns about their movements and activities. They practiced techniques for detecting surveillance that allowed them to recognize when they were being watched or followed by individuals who might be planning kidnapping attempts. They developed communication systems that enabled rapid reporting of suspicious activities and coordinated responses when members believed they were in immediate danger. Most importantly, they established buddy systems that ensured no member traveled alone or attended potentially dangerous events without backup support from other sisterhood members who could intervene if kidnapping attempts occurred. The defensive mobility protocols proved their effectiveness within weeks of implementation. Multiple attempted surveillance operations were detected and disrupted before they could gather sufficient information to plan successful kidnapping attempts. Criminal operatives who had expected to easily monitor sisterhood members found themselves exposed and forced to abandon their intelligence-gathering efforts. But the women understood that purely defensive measures would be insufficient to address the kidnapping threat completely. Criminal networks possessed professional capabilities and unlimited resources that could eventually overcome any defensive system through sustained pressure and tactical innovation. The solution required the sisterhood to develop offensive capabilities that could impose costs on criminal networks for targeting their members. Rather than simply trying to avoid kidnapping attempts, they needed to create consequences that would make such attempts counterproductive for criminal operators. Isabel Moreau's journalistic background proved invaluable for developing these offensive capabilities. Her experience in investigation and documentation provided the foundation for intelligence operations that could expose criminal activities to law enforcement attention while maintaining operational security for sisterhood members. The approach began with systematic documentation of criminal network structures, personnel, and operational methods that could be provided to police officials who were genuinely committed to addressing organized crime, rather than relying on testimony from victims who might be intimidated or compromised. The women gathered evidence through independent investigation that could support prosecution efforts without requiring cooperation from vulnerable individuals. The intelligence operations revealed that criminal networks exploiting Bohemian culture were part of much larger organized crime syndicates that were involved in multiple illegal activities throughout Paris. The heroin distribution that had initially attracted sisterhood attention was just one component of comprehensive criminal enterprises that included prostitution, illegal gambling, weapons trafficking, and systematic corruption of government officials. This discovery provided opportunities for the sisterhood to ally with law enforcement officials and government agencies that had their own reasons for wanting to disrupt organized criminal operations. Rather than presenting themselves as advocates for artistic communities, which might have seemed frivolous to serious investigators, they positioned themselves as intelligence resources for comprehensive law enforcement efforts against major criminal syndicates. The collaboration with law enforcement required the women to develop new levels of operational sophistication that balanced transparency with security considerations. They needed to provide enough information to be credible and useful to investigators while protecting their own operations and personnel from criminal retaliation. Marie Dubois proved surprisingly effective at managing these delicate relationships with law enforcement officials. Her artist's training in observation and composition translated well to the challenge of presenting complex information in formats that busy investigators could quickly understand and act upon. She created detailed maps that illustrated criminal network structures and territorial divisions within artistic communities. She developed timeline analyses that showed how recruitment and exploitation operations evolved over extended periods. Most importantly, she prepared case studies that demonstrated connections between seemingly unrelated criminal activities that were actually coordinated components of larger syndicate operations. The intelligence collaboration produced results that exceeded even the most optimistic expectations. Within months of beginning systematic cooperation with law enforcement, multiple major criminal networks had been disrupted through arrests, seizures of assets, and exposure of corruption relationships that had previously protected criminal operations from official interference. The law enforcement successes created breathing room that allowed the sisterhood to expand their operations without constant fear of criminal retaliation. But the women understood that their ultimate security depended on continuing to build popular support within artistic communities, rather than relying solely on official protection that could be withdrawn if political circumstances changed. The expansion effort focused on developing what they called cultural magnetism that would draw artists naturally towards sisterhood venues without requiring aggressive marketing or recruitment efforts. The concept was based on the understanding that genuine artistic community was inherently more attractive than artificial alternatives offered by criminal networks, but only if people had access to authentic experiences that demonstrated the difference. Louise Girard spearheaded the Cultural Magnetism Initiative by organizing collaborative artistic projects that showcased the creative potential that emerged when artists could work together without the psychological manipulation and chemical dependencies that characterized criminal-controlled venues. These projects demonstrated that drug-free artistic collaboration could produce results that were more innovative and emotionally satisfying than anything achievable through artificial chemical enhancement. The collaborative projects included group paintings that incorporated contributions from dozens of artists working together over extended periods, community theatre productions that involved everyone from writers and actors to set designers and musicians in comprehensive creative partnerships, literary magazines that published work by writers who had found their authentic voices through participation in supportive artistic communities. The results were extraordinary in ways that surprised even the women who had organized these initiatives. The collaborative artworks possessed qualities of creativity and emotional depth that individual artists working in isolation rarely achieved. The community theatre productions attracted audiences from throughout Paris who were hungry for authentic cultural experiences that weren't tainted by criminal associations. Most importantly, the literary publications began attracting attention from established cultural institutions that recognized the quality of work being produced by artists who had rejected involvement with criminal networks. Gallery owners, publishers, and theatre directors who had previously been reluctant to associate with alternative cultural venues began seeking opportunities to collaborate with sisterhood artists. This mainstream recognition created opportunities for sisterhood members to pursue professional artistic careers without compromising their commitment to drug-free creative communities. Artists who had worried that avoiding criminal-controlled venues would limit their career prospects discovered that authentic artistic development actually provided better opportunities for long-term success than chemical-enhanced productivity that was ultimately unsustainable. The professional success of sisterhood artists created powerful incentives for other members of Bohemian communities to reconsider their involvement with criminal networks. When established galleries began featuring work by artists who had explicitly rejected drug culture, it became difficult to maintain the fiction that chemical enhancement was necessary for serious artistic achievement. The Cultural Magnetism Initiative also attracted international attention from artistic communities in other cities that were struggling with similar problems related to criminal exploitation of Bohemian culture. Letters began arriving from artists in London, Berlin, and New York who had heard about sisterhood operations and wanted advice about establishing similar alternative infrastructures in their own communities. Isabelle Moreau began corresponding with these international contacts, sharing information about organizational methods and security protocols that had proven effective in Paris. The exchanges revealed that criminal exploitation of artistic communities was a widespread phenomenon that required coordinated responses from artists who were committed to preserving authentic creative culture. The international correspondence led to the establishment of what became known as the International Sisterhood Network, a loose confederation of women-led organizations that shared information and resources for protecting artistic communities from criminal exploitation. The network enabled coordination of intelligence gathering, mutual support during crisis situations, and sharing of innovative approaches to cultural programming and security operations. By the summer of 1926, the original Sisterhood of Shadows had evolved far beyond its initial focus on survival in Parisian Bohemian culture. The organization had become a model for sustainable alternative cultural institutions that could compete successfully with criminal networks, while maintaining authentic artistic values and supporting genuine creative development. The transformation from informal survival network to international cultural movement represented one of the most remarkable organizational achievements in the history of urban communities. The women who had begun by simply trying to protect themselves from immediate dangers had created institutions that were reshaping artistic culture throughout Europe and beyond. But perhaps their most significant achievement was demonstrating that criminal exploitation of creative communities wasn't inevitable or irresistible. Through intelligence, organization, and sustained commitment to authentic artistic values, dedicated individuals could create alternatives that were not just safer than criminal-controlled venues, but actually superior in terms of fostering genuine creative development and human flourishing. The teenage girls who had arrived in Paris with dreams of participating in avant-garde culture had discovered that achieving those dreams required far more than artistic talent or cultural sophistication. It demanded the courage to reject easy alternatives that promised immediate gratification, but delivered systematic exploitation and eventual destruction. The women who succeeded in building sustainable alternatives had learned that authentic artistic community required the same qualities that enabled effective resistance to criminal manipulation: critical thinking, mutual support, strategic planning, and unwavering commitment to values that prioritized human welfare over individual advantage or short-term pleasure. Their success proved that even the most sophisticated criminal organizations could be defeated by ordinary individuals who possessed the intelligence to understand what they were confronting, the courage to resist despite personal risks, and the determination to create better alternatives rather than simply complaining about existing problems. The Sisterhood's legacy would extend far beyond the immediate crisis that had inspired its formation, providing models and inspiration for future generations of artists who would face their own challenges in preserving authentic creative culture against forces that sought to exploit human creativity for destructive purposes. Purposes. The true test of the Sisterhood's innovations came during the harsh winter months of 1926, when a new crisis emerged that would challenge everything they had built. As temperatures plummeted and snow blanketed the narrow streets of Montmartre, the women discovered that their success in disrupting criminal operations had attracted attention from forces far more dangerous than local drug dealers and recruiters. The warning signs began appearing in late November when several Sisterhood venues reported visits from well-dressed strangers who claimed to be cultural enthusiasts from other European cities. These visitors asked sophisticated questions about artistic programming and organizational methods, displaying knowledge that suggested far more than casual interest in Bohemian culture. Marie Dubois initially welcomed these apparent cultural ambassadors, viewing their interest as validation of the Sisterhood's achievements. But her artist's eye for detail soon detected inconsistencies in their stories that triggered the security protocols Louise Girard had developed. The visitors claimed expertise in artistic movements that didn't exist, referenced cultural institutions that had never operated, and displayed mannerisms that suggested military or police training rather than Bohemian sensibilities. Isabel Moreau's investigation revealed that these mysterious visitors were advanced scouts for what appeared to be a coordinated intelligence operation, targeting alternative cultural networks throughout Europe. Similar figures had been observed in London, Berlin, and Vienna, conducting identical reconnaissance activities at venues that had been inspired by sisterhood innovations. The scope of this surveillance suggested that criminal networks had escalated their response to organized resistance by seeking support from government agencies or foreign intelligence services that viewed alternative cultural movements as potential threats to political stability. The women realized they were no longer simply confronting profit-motivated criminals, but systematic opposition from institutions that possessed resources and authorities far exceeding anything they had previously encountered. This revelation forced a fundamental reassessment of the sisterhood's position and capabilities. The organizational structures that had proven effective against criminal networks were potentially inadequate for confronting government surveillance operations that could operate with legal authority and unlimited resources. The challenge was complicated by the fact that the women couldn't be certain about the motivations or objectives of the agencies conducting surveillance. Were they investigating potential subversive activities? Were they gathering intelligence for foreign governments interested in disrupting French cultural institutions? Or were they simply documenting innovative social movements that might be worth studying or replicating? The uncertainty created a dilemma that tested the sisterhood's commitment to maintaining open, welcoming cultural programming while protecting their operations from infiltration by potentially hostile forces. Too much security could destroy the authentic artistic atmosphere that made their venues attractive, but too little security could expose members to risks that were impossible to calculate or defend against. Louise Girard proposed a solution that demonstrated the sophisticated strategic thinking the organization had developed during its evolution from survival network to cultural institution. Rather than implementing obvious security measures that would signal awareness of surveillance, she suggested what she called transparent opacity, maintaining completely open operations while developing invisible methods for monitoring and controlling who had access to sensitive information about organizational methods and personnel. The transparent opacity approach required the sisterhood to compartmentalize their operations in ways that allowed genuine cultural activities to continue without restriction, while protecting critical intelligence about security protocols, member identities, and organizational structure from unauthorized access. Cultural programming remained completely open to anyone genuinely interested in artistic activities, but operational information was restricted to trusted members who had demonstrated long-term commitment to sisterhood values. Marie Dubois adapted her salon hosting techniques to implement these new security requirements. Her gatherings maintained their reputation for intellectual stimulation and creative collaboration, but conversations about organizational matters were subtly guided away from areas that might provide useful intelligence to hostile observers. Visitors could participate fully in artistic activities while remaining unaware of the security measures and operational protocols that protected the infrastructure supporting those activities. The compartmentalization strategy proved remarkably effective at neutralizing government surveillance efforts. Intelligence operatives who attended sisterhood events found genuine artistic programming that provided no evidence of subversive activities or security threats. Their reports described legitimate cultural gatherings that appeared to pose no danger to political stability or public order. Meanwhile, the actual organizational infrastructure continued operating through channels that remained completely invisible to external observation. Member recruitment, security training, and coordination with law enforcement agencies proceeded through personal relationships and informal communications that left no documentary evidence and provided no opportunities for infiltration by hostile intelligence services. But the women understood that defensive measures alone would be insufficient to ensure long-term security against government surveillance. They needed to develop positive relationships with official institutions that would provide protection against hostile intelligence operations while maintaining their independence and commitment to serving artistic communities. Isabelle Moreau's journalistic background proved invaluable for establishing these official relationships. Her professional credentials and reputation for objective reporting provided credibility with government officials, who might have been skeptical of approaches from organizations they viewed as potentially subversive social movements. She began cultivating relationships with cultural ministry officials who were responsible for supporting legitimate artistic institutions throughout France. Rather than presenting the sisterhood as an alternative to existing cultural infrastructure, she positioned their work as complementary services that enhanced the effectiveness of official programs by providing specialized support for vulnerable artistic communities. The approach emphasized the sisterhood's contributions to public order and social stability through their success in reducing criminal exploitation of Bohemian culture. Government officials who were concerned about organized crime and foreign intelligence operations found the women's intelligence gathering and law enforcement collaboration valuable enough to justify official recognition and protection. The cultivation of official relationships required the sisterhood to develop new capabilities for presenting their work in formats that bureaucratic institutions could understand and support. They created formal reports documenting their contributions to reducing crime and supporting artistic development. They established procedures for coordinating with government agencies while maintaining operational independence and commitment to serving artistic communities. Most importantly, they learned to translate their grassroots organizing experience into language that resonated with officials who were responsible for managing complex institutional relationships and political considerations. The women discovered that their innovations in community organizing and cultural programming were actually applicable to much broader challenges related to social stability and civic engagement. The official recognition that resulted from these efforts provided the sisterhood with protections against hostile surveillance, while creating new opportunities for expanding their impact beyond artistic communities. Government support enabled them to establish training programs that shared their organizational methods with other social service organizations throughout France. The training programs attracted participants from women's organizations, youth groups, religious institutions, and community development agencies that were struggling with similar challenges related to protecting vulnerable populations from exploitation by criminal networks or hostile political movements. The sisterhood's experience in building alternative institutions and developing security capabilities proved relevant to a wide range of social organizing efforts. But perhaps their most significant innovation during this period was the development of what they called cultural diplomacy, using their international network to build relationships between artistic communities that could resist manipulation by hostile foreign intelligence services. The correspondence networks that had emerged from their success in Paris became channels for sharing information about threats and opportunities that transcended national boundaries. The Cultural Diplomacy Initiative began with systematic documentation of criminal and intelligence operations targeting artistic communities throughout Europe. Women's organizations in different cities shared information about suspicious activities, recruitment techniques, and security measures that had proven effective in different cultural and political contexts. This intelligence sharing revealed patterns of manipulation that would have remained invisible to individual organizations operating in isolation. Criminal networks and hostile intelligence services were using similar techniques in multiple cities, suggesting coordination that required international responses to address effectively. The international coordination also enabled the development of mutual support systems that could provide assistance when local organizations faced threats that exceeded their individual capabilities. When sisterhood operations in one city encountered serious opposition, partner organizations in other locations could provide resources, personnel, or political support that helped maintain operations during crisis periods. The Cultural Diplomacy Network attracted attention from official diplomatic institutions that recognized the value of informal international relationships for gathering intelligence and maintaining stability in regions where formal government channels might be inadequate or compromised. Cultural ministry officials began consulting with sisterhood leaders about international developments that might affect artistic communities or suggest emerging security threats. These official consultations provided the women with access to government intelligence that enhanced their ability to protect their own operations, while contributing to broader security efforts that served national interests. The relationship was mutually beneficial, with government agencies receiving valuable grassroots intelligence, while sisterhood organizations gained official support for their cultural programming and security operations. By the spring of 1927, the sisterhood had evolved into something unprecedented in the history of social movements, a grassroots organization that had successfully integrated with official institutions while maintaining its independence and commitment to serving vulnerable communities. They had demonstrated that citizen-organized networks could develop capabilities that complemented rather than competed with government agencies responsible for public safety and social stability. The integration process had required the women to develop new levels of political sophistication and organizational maturity that enabled them to navigate complex relationships with multiple stakeholders while preserving their core mission and values. They learned to present their work in ways that satisfied bureaucratic requirements without compromising their commitment to serving artistic communities according to principles they had developed through years of grassroots organizing. But perhaps their most remarkable achievement was proving that alternative institutions created by ordinary citizens could become so effective and valuable that they attracted support from the same official systems they had originally been established to circumvent the women who had begun by protecting themselves from immediate dangers, had created organizations that were contributing to national security and international stability. The transformation demonstrated that grassroots social movements could achieve sustainable impact by developing capabilities that served broader public interests, rather than simply advocating for particular constituencies or ideological positions. The sisterhood's success in building bridges between community organizing and institutional power provided a model for citizen engagement that transcended traditional boundaries between official and unofficial social action. As summer approached, the women who had survived the heroin epidemic through intelligence, cooperation, and unwavering commitment to authentic artistic values found themselves in positions of influence they had never anticipated when they first began sharing information about dangerous individuals and locations in Parisian cafes. Their journey from powerless targets of criminal exploitation to recognized leaders in cultural diplomacy and security cooperation represented one of the most remarkable examples of citizen empowerment in modern European history. They had proven that ordinary individuals could develop extraordinary capabilities when they possessed the courage to reject destructive alternatives and the determination to create better solutions. The teenage girls who had arrived in Paris seeking authentic artistic experience had discovered that achieving their dreams required far more than talent or cultural sophistication. It demanded the wisdom to recognize manipulation, the strength to resist exploitation, and the vision to create institutions that could protect future generations from similar threats. But their greatest contribution may have been demonstrating that survival itself could be transformed into a form of cultural creation. The networks and institutions they built to protect themselves became sources of inspiration and empowerment for countless others who faced their own challenges in preserving human dignity and creative potential against forces that sought to exploit vulnerability for destructive purposes. The winter crisis that had threatened to destroy everything they had accomplished instead became an opportunity to prove that their innovations were robust enough to survive and adapt to new challenges. The women who had learned to protect artistic communities from criminal exploitation discovered that their skills were applicable to much broader threats that required equally sophisticated and coordinated responses. Their success in navigating government surveillance and establishing official partnerships while maintaining grassroots authenticity provided evidence that citizen-organized movements could achieve sustainable impact without sacrificing the values and relationships that had made their success possible in the first place. As the seasons changed and new challenges emerged, the sisterhood prepared to face whatever tests the future might bring, confident that their combination of practical intelligence, mutual support, and unwavering commitment to human flourishing would enable them to continue serving the communities that depended on their protection and guidance. The women who had survived by learning to read the subtle signs of danger in smoke-filled cafes had become masters of recognizing and responding to threats that most people couldn't even perceive. Their story continued to unfold as they discovered new applications for the survival skills that had enabled them to transform potential victimization into powerful tools for positive social change. The heroin epidemic that had nearly destroyed Parisian artistic culture had instead become the catalyst for innovations in community organizing, security cooperation, and cultural diplomacy that would influence social movements throughout Europe and beyond for generations to come. For generations to come. The methods these remarkable women developed for reading social environments would prove essential as new and more sophisticated threats emerged during the tumultuous months of 1927. The success of their cultural diplomacy initiatives had attracted attention from criminal organizations that were far more international and well-connected than the local drug dealers they had originally confronted in Parisian cafes. These new adversaries operated with resources and coordination that spanned multiple countries, using legitimate business enterprises as cover for systematic exploitation of artistic communities throughout Europe. Unlike the crude recruitment tactics employed by street-level dealers, these organizations had developed sophisticated psychological profiles of creative personalities and employed manipulation techniques that were nearly impossible to detect without extensive training in recognizing subtle forms of coercion. The escalation began when Louise Girard noticed that several promising young artists who had been successfully integrated into sisterhood communities were suddenly displaying behavioral changes that didn't match any of the patterns they had previously documented. These individuals remained physically present at alternative cultural events, but their personalities seemed to have undergone fundamental shifts that made them appear distant and artificially cheerful in ways that triggered every instinct the women had developed for detecting manipulation. The affected artists would arrive at salon gatherings with expensive new clothing and art supplies that they claimed were gifts from generous patrons who had discovered their work through legitimate galleries. They spoke enthusiastically about exciting opportunities for exhibitions and commissions that would advance their careers, but became evasive when asked for specific details about these mysterious benefactors or the nature of their proposed collaborations. Most disturbing was the subtle but persistent way these individuals began encouraging other sisterhood members to consider similar opportunities for patronage and professional advancement. Their suggestions were never direct or obvious, but followed patterns that suggested careful coaching in psychological manipulation techniques that were far more sophisticated than anything the women had previously encountered. Marie Dubois recognized the threat immediately, drawing on her years of experience, observing how criminal recruiters adapted their methods to exploit different types of vulnerability. The new approach bypassed the obvious dangers that sisterhood members had learned to avoid, instead targeting their legitimate professional ambitions and desire for artistic recognition in ways that made resistance appear foolish and self-destructive. The criminal networks had clearly studied sisterhood operations extensively and developed recruitment strategies specifically designed to circumvent the protective measures that had proven effective against earlier threats. Rather than approaching potential victims directly, they were using compromised artists as unwitting recruiters who could provide credible endorsements for opportunities that seemed too attractive to refuse. Isabelle Moreau's investigation revealed that the new criminal operations were connected to international networks that had established legitimate business enterprises in multiple European cities. These front organizations operated actual galleries, publishing houses, and performance venues that provided real opportunities for artistic development while serving as recruitment pipelines for more exploitative activities. The sophistication of this approach made it extremely difficult to warn potential victims about the dangers they faced. The opportunities being offered were genuine in many respects, with artists receiving actual exhibitions, publications, and financial compensation for their work. The exploitation occurred gradually through contract terms and professional relationships that created psychological and financial dependencies over extended periods. Artists who accepted patronage from these organizations found themselves increasingly isolated from independent artistic communities, as their new benefactors provided comprehensive support that made alternative relationships seem unnecessary. The isolation was achieved through generous financial arrangements that eliminated economic pressures, exclusive social opportunities that replaced previous friendships, and professional commitments that consumed all available time and energy. By the time victims recognized that they had been systematically separated from independent support networks, they were often too psychologically and financially dependent on their exploiters to contemplate escape. The criminal organizations had learned to create golden cages that were far more effective than crude coercion at maintaining control over talented individuals who could be used to recruit subsequent victims. The sisterhood's response to this new threat required innovations that went beyond their previous security measures and protective recruitment strategies. They needed methods for helping people evaluate legitimate professional opportunities without discouraging artistic ambition or creating paranoia that would interfere with genuine career development. Louise Girard developed what she called opportunity assessment protocols that helped artists analyze professional offers according to criteria that could reveal hidden manipulation without requiring them to reject all external support. The protocols focused on contract terms, social isolation requirements, and communication restrictions that were common features of exploitative relationships but rarely present in legitimate professional arrangements. The assessment process began with systematic evaluation of any opportunity that required artists to modify their existing social relationships or limit their participation in independent artistic communities. Legitimate patrons and professional collaborators understood that creative individuals needed diverse sources of inspiration and support, while exploitative organizations typically demanded exclusive loyalty that isolated victims from potential sources of assistance. Contract terms provided another reliable indicator of exploitative intent, particularly provisions that created long-term financial dependencies or restricted artists' ability to work with other organizations. Legitimate business relationships were typically structured to benefit both parties over time, while exploitative arrangements were designed to create increasing dependence that made escape progressively more difficult. Most importantly, the assessment protocols evaluated the communication patterns that characterized interactions with potential patrons or collaborators. Legitimate professionals were typically transparent about their backgrounds, objectives, and expectations, while manipulative organizations often used vague promises and emotional manipulation to discourage careful evaluation of their actual terms and conditions. The opportunity assessment protocols proved remarkably effective at helping sisterhood members distinguish between genuine professional opportunities and sophisticated recruitment attempts. Artists who used these evaluation methods were able to pursue legitimate career advancement while avoiding the golden cage traps that had been designed to exploit their professional ambitions. But the women understood that individual protection was insufficient to address the broader threat posed by international criminal networks that were systematically infiltrating European artistic communities. The scope and sophistication of these operations required coordinated responses that could match the resources and capabilities of well-funded criminal enterprises. Marie Dubois proposed expanding their cultural diplomacy initiatives to create what she called an artistic intelligence network that could gather and share information about criminal operations targeting creative communities throughout Europe. The concept was based on the understanding that international criminal networks were vulnerable to intelligence gathering by grassroots organizations that possessed credibility within artistic communities. The Artistic Intelligence Network began with systematic documentation of suspicious patron organizations and professional opportunities that had been reported by sisterhood members and their international partners. This information was compiled into comprehensive databases that revealed patterns of criminal activity that would have remained invisible to individual organizations operating in isolation. The intelligence gathering revealed that the same criminal networks were operating in multiple cities, using identical methods and often the same front organizations. Artists in Paris were being approached by the same galleries and patrons that were simultaneously targeting creative communities in London, Berlin, and Vienna, suggesting coordination that required international responses to address effectively. More importantly, the intelligence network enabled early warning systems that could alert artistic communities about emerging threats before criminal organizations had time to establish effective operations in new territories. When suspicious activities were detected in one city, partner organizations in other locations could implement preventive measures that made their communities less vulnerable to similar approaches. Isabelle Moreau's journalistic experience proved invaluable for transforming raw intelligence into actionable information that could be used by law enforcement agencies and government officials who were responsible for addressing international criminal activities. Her reports provided detailed documentation of criminal network structures and operations that complemented official investigations while protecting the security of grassroots intelligence sources. The collaboration with law enforcement agencies revealed that criminal exploitation of artistic communities was connected to much larger international enterprises that were involved in multiple forms of illegal activity, including money laundering, human trafficking, and systematic corruption of government officials. The intelligence provided by artistic communities filled gaps in official investigations that had been limited by the criminals' ability to operate within legitimate cultural institutions. The success of intelligence collaboration created opportunities for the sisterhood to expand their impact beyond protective services. For individual artists, government agencies began consulting with them about broader security issues related to international criminal activities and foreign intelligence operations that threaten national stability. These official consultations provided the women with access to resources and authorities that enhanced their ability to protect artistic communities while contributing to broader security efforts that served public interests. The relationship evolved into genuine partnership, where grassroots intelligence capabilities complemented official law enforcement resources in ways that benefited both community protection and national security. But perhaps the most significant development during this period was the recognition by cultural institutions throughout Europe that the sisterhood's innovations in community organizing and security cooperation represented valuable models for addressing similar challenges in other contexts. Universities, museums, and cultural foundations began seeking advice about protecting their communities from exploitation while maintaining the openness and accessibility that were essential to their educational missions. The consultation requests led to the establishment of training programs that shared sisterhood methods with professional staff at cultural institutions who were responsible for student safety and community development. These programs adapted grassroots organizing techniques to institutional contexts while preserving the principles of mutual support and collective protection that had made the original sisterhood operations successful. The institutional training programs created new opportunities for expanding the impact of survival strategies that had been developed specifically for Bohemian communities. Social workers, youth program directors, and community organizers discovered that sisterhood methods for recognizing manipulation and building protective networks were applicable to their work with vulnerable populations who faced different but related forms of exploitation. The expansion into institutional training also provided financial sustainability for sisterhood operations that had previously depended on volunteer labor and informal resource sharing. Cultural institutions and government agencies were willing to pay for training services that enhanced their capabilities for protecting the communities they served, creating revenue streams that enabled full-time staff and professional development for grassroots organizers. By the autumn of 1927, the sisterhood had evolved into something unprecedented in the history of social movements. A grassroots organization that had successfully integrated community organizing, intelligence cooperation, and professional training into a comprehensive approach to social protection that served multiple constituencies while maintaining its original commitment to artistic communities. The transformation demonstrated that citizen-organized networks could develop capabilities that were valuable to official institutions without sacrificing the authenticity and community connections that had made their grassroots work effective. The women had learned to navigate complex relationships with government agencies and cultural institutions while preserving their independence and commitment to serving vulnerable populations, according to principles they had developed through years of community organizing. The success of this integration approach attracted international attention from social movements and government agencies that were struggling with similar challenges related to protecting vulnerable communities from systematic exploitation. Delegations began arriving from other countries to study sisterhood methods and explore possibilities for adapting their innovations to different cultural and political contexts. The international recognition created new responsibilities and opportunities that tested the organization's capacity for growth, while maintaining the personal relationships and community connections that had enabled their original success. The women had to develop new capabilities for sharing their knowledge without compromising the security measures that protected their ongoing operations. Louise Girard emerged as the most effective spokesperson for international outreach efforts, combining her practical experience in community protection with communication skills that enabled her to present complex organizational methods in formats that diverse audiences could understand and adapt to their own circumstances. Her presentations emphasized the universal principles underlying sisterhood innovations, rather than specific techniques that might not translate effectively to different cultural contexts. The core concepts of collective intelligence gathering, mutual protection, and alternative institution building could be applied in various ways depending on local conditions and community needs. The international outreach also enabled the establishment of formal partnerships with women's organizations and social movements in other countries that were developing their own approaches to community protection and social change. These partnerships created opportunities for sharing resources and expertise that enhanced the capabilities of all participating organizations. Most importantly, the international network provided mutual support systems that could assist individual organizations when they faced threats or challenges that exceeded their local resources. When criminal networks or hostile political movements targeted community organizers in one country, partner organizations in other locations could provide assistance that helped maintain operations during crisis periods. The development of international mutual support capabilities represented the culmination of the sisterhood's evolution from survival network to comprehensive social movement. The women who had begun by protecting themselves from immediate dangers in Parisian cafes had created institutions that were contributing to community protection and social stability throughout Europe and beyond. Their success proved that grassroots organizing could achieve sustainable impact by developing capabilities that served broader public interests while maintaining commitment to the vulnerable communities that had inspired their original efforts. The survival strategies that had enabled them to navigate criminal exploitation had evolved into models for citizen empowerment that transcended the specific circumstances of their origins. As winter approached, the women who had transformed potential victimization into powerful tools for social change prepared to face new challenges that would test their ability to maintain their innovations while adapting to evolving threats and opportunities. Their story continued to unfold as they discovered new applications for the community, organizing principles that had enabled them to survive and thrive in one of history's most dangerous cultural environments. The techniques they had developed for reading social situations, building protective relationships, and creating alternative institutions had proven applicable to challenges far beyond the heroin epidemic that had initially threatened their survival. Their methods had become resources for addressing systematic exploitation and community vulnerability in contexts that extended throughout European society and beyond. The legacy of their survival would influence social movements and community organizing efforts for generations, providing evidence that ordinary individuals could develop extraordinary capabilities when they possessed the courage to reject destructive alternatives and the determination to create institutions that served human flourishing rather than individual profit or political control. The women who had learned to survive by creating better alternatives had discovered that survival itself could become a form of social innovation that benefited entire communities rather than just individual participants. Their transformation from potential victims to community leaders demonstrated the power of collective action based on mutual support and shared commitment to protecting vulnerable populations from systematic exploitation. The success of these international partnerships created unexpected opportunities that would transform the sisterhood's understanding of their own capabilities and potential impact. As correspondence flowed in from women's organizations across Europe, a pattern emerged that revealed the true scope of what they had achieved in Paris. The techniques they had developed for surviving the heroin epidemic weren't just applicable to drug-related dangers. Women in London were using modified versions of their protective recruitment strategies to help young factory workers avoid exploitation by unscrupulous employers who promised career advancement in exchange for compromising personal relationships. Organizations in Berlin had adapted their opportunity assessment protocols to help aspiring actresses distinguish between legitimate theatre companies and operations that used artistic auditions as recruitment mechanisms for prostitution networks. Perhaps most remarkably, women's groups in Vienna had successfully implemented sisterhood communication methods to protect university students from political recruitment efforts by extremist organizations that were systematically targeting intellectual communities throughout Austria. The coded languages and early warning systems that had originally been developed to navigate Parisian café culture proved surprisingly effective at helping young scholars recognize and resist ideological manipulation attempts. These discoveries revealed that the criminal exploitation of artistic communities had been just one manifestation of much broader patterns of systematic manipulation that targeted vulnerable populations throughout European society. The same psychological techniques that drug dealers used to recruit Bohemian artists were being employed by political extremists, labor exploiters, and human traffickers who understood how to weaponize legitimate human needs for community, purpose, and recognition. Marie Dubois found herself grappling with implications that extended far beyond anything she had imagined when she first began documenting suspicious patterns in Montparnasse cafes. The survival strategies they had developed weren't simply responses to a specific local crisis, but innovations in human psychology and social organization that addressed fundamental vulnerabilities in modern urban life. The realization was both exhilarating and overwhelming. If their methods were applicable to such diverse forms of exploitation, it meant their work had potential impact that could benefit millions of people who face similar challenges in protecting themselves from systematic manipulation. But it also meant they were confronting adversaries whose resources and sophistication far exceeded anything they had previously understood. Louise Girard's medical training helped her process these revelations by approaching them as symptoms of underlying social pathologies that required comprehensive treatment rather than isolated interventions. Just as infectious diseases could manifest different symptoms while sharing common causes, the various forms of exploitation they were discovering appeared to be expressions of systematic problems in how modern societies organized themselves and protected vulnerable populations. Her analysis suggested that the effectiveness of sisterhood methods reflected their ability to address root causes rather than surface symptoms of social vulnerability. By teaching people to recognize manipulation patterns, build protective relationships, and create alternative institutions, they were providing tools that could resist multiple forms of exploitation rather than just specific criminal activities. This understanding led to a fundamental shift in how the women conceived of their mission and organizational structure. Rather than viewing themselves primarily as protectors of artistic communities, they began developing what they called universal protection principles that could be adapted to address systematic exploitation in any context where vulnerable populations were being targeted by sophisticated predators. The universal protection principles began with the recognition that exploitation typically followed predictable patterns regardless of the specific context or target population. Predatory organizations invariably used isolation tactics to separate victims from independent support networks. they employed psychological manipulation techniques that exploited legitimate human needs for recognition, community, and purpose. They created dependency relationships that made escape increasingly difficult over time. Understanding these common patterns enabled the development of protection strategies that could be adapted to different circumstances while maintaining core effectiveness. The opportunity assessment protocols that helped artists evaluate professional offers could be modified to help factory workers analyze employment contracts, students assess political organizations, or immigrants evaluate assistance programs that might be fraudulent. Similarly, the alternative institution building approaches that had created safe cultural venues could be adapted to establish protective spaces for other vulnerable populations. The communication networks that enabled early warning systems for artistic communities could be modified to serve workers' organizations, student groups, or immigrant communities that faced different but related forms of systematic exploitation. Isabel Moreau's journalistic experience proved invaluable for documenting these universal patterns and developing training materials that could share protection principles across different cultural and social contexts. Her background in research and investigation enabled her to identify common elements in exploitation schemes while respecting the unique characteristics of different communities and their specific vulnerabilities. The documentation process revealed that successful protection efforts consistently incorporated certain essential elements that transcended specific contexts or target populations. Effective resistance to exploitation required accurate intelligence about predatory operations, strong communication networks that enabled rapid information sharing, alternative institutions that provided legitimate alternatives to exploitative opportunities, and training programs that helped potential victims recognize and respond to manipulation attempts. These universal elements became the foundation for comprehensive training programs that could be adapted to serve diverse communities while maintaining proven effectiveness. Social workers, community organizers, religious leaders, and educational administrators discovered that sisterhood methods could enhance their existing efforts to protect the populations they serve from various forms of systematic exploitation. The training programs attracted participants from throughout Europe who were struggling with challenges that appeared different on the surface but shared fundamental characteristics with the problems the sisterhood had learned to address. Youth program directors dealing with gang recruitment, women's shelter coordinators confronting human trafficking, and immigrant service providers facing fraudulent assistance schemes found that protection principles developed in Parisian artistic communities were directly applicable to their work. The expansion into comprehensive social protection training created new opportunities for the sisterhood to develop sustainable funding sources that could support their ongoing operations while maintaining their independence from government agencies or other institutions that might compromise their effectiveness. Training fees and consultation contracts provided revenue streams that enabled professional staff development and organizational growth without requiring dependence on grants or subsidies that might come with restrictive conditions. But perhaps most importantly, the universal protection approach enabled the women to maintain their original commitment to serving artistic communities while expanding their impact to benefit much broader populations. Rather than abandoning their roots in Bohemian culture, they used their success in that context as a foundation for addressing similar challenges faced by vulnerable people throughout European society. The integration of community-specific services with universal protection principles created organizational structures that were both deeply rooted in particular communities and broadly applicable to diverse social contexts. Artists continue to receive specialized support that address their unique vulnerabilities and needs, while the methods developed through that work benefited factory workers, students, immigrants, and other populations that faced related forms of systematic exploitation. This balanced approach proved remarkably effective at maintaining the authentic community connections that had enabled the sisterhood's original success while expanding their capabilities to serve much larger populations. the women discovered that their commitment to serving artistic communities actually enhanced their credibility and effectiveness when working with other vulnerable populations, because it demonstrated their genuine dedication to community protection rather than abstract social reform. The autumn of 1928 brought recognition from unexpected quarters that validated the sisterhood's evolution into a comprehensive social protection movement. Academic researchers from universities throughout Europe began requesting access to their methods and documentation for scholarly studies of community organizing and social innovation. The academic interest created opportunities for the women to formalize their knowledge and training approaches through partnerships with educational institutions that could provide resources for research and development while maintaining the grassroots authenticity that had made their work effective. University collaborations enabled systematic study of protection methods and their adaptation to different contexts, generating evidence that supported expansion efforts while preserving community-based approaches to social change. Government agencies also began seeking formal partnerships that could integrate sisterhood capabilities with official social services and law enforcement efforts. Rather than simply consulting with grassroots organizers, bureaucratic institutions wanted to establish ongoing relationships that could enhance their effectiveness while providing sustainable support for community protection efforts. These official partnerships required the women to develop new capabilities for navigating complex institutional relationships while maintaining their independence and commitment to serving vulnerable communities. They learned to present their work in formats that satisfied bureaucratic requirements without compromising the principles and methods that had made their grassroots efforts successful. The challenge of maintaining authenticity while working with official institutions led to innovations in organizational structure that enabled different types of activities to coexist within the same movement while preserving their distinct characteristics and effectiveness. Community-based services continued operating according to grassroots principles, while training and consultation activities were adapted to meet institutional requirements without interfering with direct service provision. Marie Dubois proved particularly skilled at managing these complex relationships, drawing on her artist's understanding of composition and balance to create organizational structures that maintained harmony between different activities and constituencies. Her ability to see how various elements could work together without compromising each other's integrity enabled the sisterhood to expand their impact while preserving the community connections that had inspired their original success. The organizational innovations attracted attention from social movement researchers who recognized the sisterhood as a unique example of successful integration between grassroots organizing and institutional collaboration. Academic studies began documenting their methods as models for citizen engagement that could achieve sustainable impact while maintaining community authenticity and independence. But the women understood that academic recognition and institutional partnerships were valuable primarily as tools for expanding their protective capabilities rather than as ends in themselves. Their ultimate success would be measured by their ability to help vulnerable people avoid exploitation and build fulfilling lives within supportive communities, not by the recognition they received from official institutions or scholarly observers. This understanding kept them focused on continuous improvement of their protection methods and expansion of their services to reach more people who needed assistance. Each success story from a person who had avoided exploitation or escaped from dangerous situations provided motivation for developing new approaches and reaching additional communities that faced similar challenges. Louise Girard began developing what she called impact tracking systems that could document the long-term outcomes of sisterhood interventions while protecting the privacy and security of the people they served. These systems enabled continuous evaluation and improvement of protection methods, while generating evidence that could support expansion efforts and secure additional resources for community services. The impact tracking revealed that sisterhood interventions were producing sustained positive outcomes that extended far beyond immediate crisis prevention. People who received protection services typically went on to develop successful careers, stable relationships, and community leadership roles that enabled them to help others avoid similar dangers. More importantly, many protection recipients became active participants in sisterhood activities, creating multiplier effects that expanded the organization's capabilities while deepening its community connections. The network grew organically as grateful recipients became protective resources for subsequent generations of vulnerable individuals who needed assistance. The winter months brought new challenges that tested the sisterhood's ability to maintain their expanding operations while adapting to evolving threats from criminal organizations that had learned to counter some of their protection methods. Success had made them more visible to hostile forces that were developing increasingly sophisticated approaches to circumventing community-based protection efforts. The criminal organizations had studied sisterhood methods extensively and were beginning to implement counter-strategies that exploited weaknesses in community protection approaches. Rather than simply trying to overwhelm grassroots defenses through superior resources, hostile forces were developing manipulation techniques specifically designed to turn community protection networks against themselves. The new threats required innovations in security and communication that could maintain the openness and accessibility that made sisterhood services effective while protecting against infiltration attempts that were becoming increasingly difficult to detect. The women had to develop new levels of operational sophistication while preserving the authentic community relationships that enabled their protective work. Isabel Moreau's investigation revealed that criminal counter-strategies were being coordinated internationally through networks that shared intelligence about community protection efforts and developed standardized approaches to undermining grassroots organizing activities. The scope of organized opposition suggested that the sisterhood's success had attracted attention from forces that viewed effective community protection as a threat to their broader exploitation operations. This realization forced another fundamental reassessment of the organization's position and capabilities. The women understood that their continued success would require them to match the sophistication and coordination of international criminal networks while maintaining the community authenticity and grassroots principles that had made their original work effective. The challenge was enormous, but the women who had survived the heroin epidemic through intelligence, cooperation, and unwavering commitment to community protection were prepared to face whatever tests the future might bring. Their journey from powerless potential victims to leaders of an international social protection movement had taught them that ordinary people could develop extraordinary capabilities when they possessed the courage to reject destructive alternatives and the determination to create institutions that served human flourishing. The story of their remarkable transformation continued to unfold as they discovered new applications for the survival skills that had enabled them to protect artistic communities from systematic exploitation. Their methods were becoming resources for addressing social vulnerability and criminal manipulation throughout European society and beyond, proving that the techniques developed in Parisian cafes had universal applications that could benefit anyone who faced systematic threats to their safety, dignity, and independence. The women who had learned to read the subtle signs of danger in Bohemian culture had become masters of recognizing and responding to exploitation attempts that most people couldn't even perceive. Their expertise in building protective relationships and creating alternative institutions was transforming how vulnerable communities throughout Europe understood their own capabilities for collective self-defense and mutual support. But their greatest achievement may have been demonstrating that survival strategies could evolve into comprehensive approaches to social change that benefited entire populations rather than just individual participants. The protection methods they developed had become tools for community empowerment that enabled ordinary people to resist systematic exploitation while building the supportive relationships and alternative institutions necessary for human flourishing in increasingly complex and dangerous social environments. The teenage girls who had arrived in Paris seeking authentic artistic experience had discovered that achieving their dreams required them to become innovators in community organizing, social protection, and international cooperation. Their success proved that the most effective responses to systematic exploitation emerged from the communities that were being targeted, when those communities possessed the knowledge, resources, and determination necessary to protect themselves while creating better alternatives for future generations. As the decade drew to a close, the women who had survived by learning to create better alternatives prepared to face whatever new challenges the changing times might bring, confident that their combination of practical intelligence, mutual support, and unwavering commitment to human dignity would enable them to continue serving the communities that depended on their protection and guidance. Their legacy would continue influencing social movements and community organizing efforts long after the immediate crisis that had inspired their formation had been resolved, providing lasting evidence that ordinary individuals could achieve extraordinary impact when they possess the courage to transform potential victimization into powerful tools for positive social change. The transformation of these survival networks reached an unexpected turning point in early 1929, when a discovery in an abandoned warehouse near the Seine revealed the true scope of what they had been confronting all along. Marie Dubois received an urgent message from a contact within the police prefecture, asking her to examine documents that had been recovered during a raid on what officials initially believed was a simple counterfeiting operation. What Marie found among the seized papers fundamentally altered her understanding of everything the sisterhood had accomplished. Spread across wooden tables in the police evidence room were detailed organizational charts that mapped criminal networks spanning not just Paris, but major cities throughout Europe and beyond. The documents revealed systematic coordination between groups that the women had assumed were operating independently, showing connection patterns that explained why their various adversaries had seemed to adapt so quickly to sisterhood countermeasures. But the most shocking discovery came in the form of detailed profiles that criminal organizations had compiled on individual sisterhood members. These files contained personal information that could only have been gathered through extensive surveillance operations, including family backgrounds, financial situations, psychological assessments, and detailed analyses of each woman's role within the protection network. The criminal organizations had been studying them with the same methodical approach the women had used to understand their enemies. Louise Girard's file was particularly comprehensive, documenting her medical training, her extraction techniques, and even transcripts of conversations she had conducted during therapy sessions with former victims. The level of detail suggested surveillance that had continued for months or possibly years, using methods that the sisterhood's security protocols had failed to detect. The surveillance files revealed that criminal organizations had identified the sisterhood as their primary threat to expansion operations throughout Europe. Internal communications discussed specific strategies for neutralizing key personnel through targeted recruitment of family members, systematic discrediting campaigns, and if necessary, direct elimination of leaders whose protective work was interfering with profitable exploitation schemes. Most disturbing were documents that outlined plans for what criminal operators called protective mimicry, creating false community organizations that would appear to offer the same services as the sisterhood, while actually functioning as recruitment pipelines for exploitation networks. These fake protection organizations were designed to capture vulnerable individuals who were seeking help, using their trust and desperation to facilitate rather than prevent their victimization. Isabelle Moreau recognized the implications immediately. The criminal networks hadn't simply been defending their existing operations against sisterhood interference. They had been conducting comprehensive intelligence gathering in preparation for systematic destruction of community protection efforts throughout Europe. The scope of their planning suggested resources and coordination that approached the level of military or intelligence service operations. The evidence also revealed why the women's various adversaries had seemed to anticipate their tactical innovations. With such consistent accuracy, criminal organizations had been sharing detailed reports about sisterhood methods, enabling rapid adaptation of countermeasures that could be deployed simultaneously across multiple cities whenever new protection techniques were implemented. This discovery forced the women to confront the possibility that their expansion efforts had actually been providing criminal networks with valuable intelligence about community protection methods that could be used to develop more effective exploitation strategies. Their success in training other organizations might have inadvertently strengthened the very forces they were trying to combat. Marie Dubois called an emergency meeting of senior sisterhood members to address the implications of these revelations and develop responses that could protect their operations while maintaining their commitment to serving vulnerable communities. The gathering took place in a location that had been secured through their police contacts, using security measures that reflected their new understanding of the surveillance capabilities they were confronting. The discussion that followed was unlike any previous strategic planning session in the organization's history. The women had to acknowledge that they were facing adversaries whose resources and sophistication far exceeded anything they had previously imagined, while also recognizing that their own success had made them high-priority targets for elimination efforts that could threaten not just their operations, but their personal safety and the welfare of their families. Some members argued for scaling back their activities to reduce their visibility and minimize the risks they were facing from organized retaliation. Others insisted that retreat would represent capitulation to forces that were systematically exploiting vulnerable populations throughout Europe, abandoning countless people who depended on community protection services for their survival and welfare. Louise Girard emerged as the voice of determined resistance during these deliberations, drawing on her experience with extraction operations to analyze the psychological warfare that criminal organizations were attempting to wage against community protection efforts. Her assessment was that intimidation campaigns were designed not just to eliminate specific threats, but to demonstrate that resistance to systematic exploitation was futile and dangerous. If the sisterhood abandoned their operations in response to criminal pressure, she argued, they would be validating the intimidation strategy and encouraging its application against other community protection efforts throughout Europe. Their retreat would signal that organized criminal networks possessed sufficient power to neutralize any grassroots resistance, potentially discouraging future protective initiatives before they could develop effective capabilities. Her analysis convinced the assembled women that maintaining their operations was not just personally necessary for their own integrity, but strategically essential for preserving the possibility of effective community protection throughout European society. They were fighting not just for their own communities, but for the principle that ordinary citizens could organize effective resistance to systematic exploitation. The decision to continue operations despite escalating threats required the sisterhood to develop entirely new levels of operational security that could protect against surveillance and infiltration attempts, while maintaining the accessibility and community connections that made their protective work effective. They needed capabilities that could match professional intelligence operations without compromising the grassroots authenticity that enabled their success. Marie Dubois proposed what she called compartmentalized transparency, an approach that would maintain completely open community services while creating invisible security layers that protected operational intelligence from hostile surveillance. The concept was based on separating protective activities into different organizational levels that could function independently while sharing only the information necessary for coordination. Community-based services would continue operating according to established protocols, remaining accessible to anyone genuinely seeking assistance, while implementing subtle screening measures that could identify potential infiltrators without creating barriers for legitimate participants. Training and consultation activities would be managed through separate channels that required additional verification procedures, but maintained their effectiveness for legitimate institutional partners. Most importantly, strategic planning and intelligence operations would be conducted through networks that remained completely invisible to external observation, using communication methods and meeting protocols that provided no opportunities for surveillance or infiltration by hostile forces. These security measures would be known only to senior members who had demonstrated long-term commitment to sisterhood values and had been thoroughly vetted through multiple verification procedures. The implementation of compartmentalized transparency required extensive reorganization that tested every leadership and coordination capability the women had developed during their evolution, from survival network to comprehensive social movement, Personnel had to be reassigned to different operational levels based on their security clearances and specialized skills, while maintaining the personal relationships and community connections that enabled effective protective work. Louise Girard took responsibility for developing the security protocols that would govern access to different organizational levels, drawing on her extraction experience to create verification procedures that could distinguish between genuine community commitment and sophisticated infiltration attempts. Her approach emphasized behavioral consistency over extended periods rather than single verification events, making it extremely difficult for hostile operatives to maintain false identities long enough to gain access to sensitive operations. The security measures proved their effectiveness within weeks of implementation, when multiple infiltration attempts were detected and neutralized before they could compromise sensitive operations or gather useful intelligence about sisterhood methods and personnel. Criminal operatives who had expected to easily penetrate community protection networks found themselves excluded from meaningful access while remaining unaware that their infiltration attempts had been identified. Meanwhile, legitimate community services continued operating without interruption, maintaining their reputation for accessibility and effectiveness while actually becoming more secure than they had ever been previously. The compartmentalized approach enabled the women to provide protective services to more people than ever before, while simultaneously developing intelligence capabilities that could support broader resistance efforts against systematic exploitation. Isabelle Moreau's journalistic skills proved essential for managing the intelligence operations that emerged from enhanced security protocols. Her experience in research and investigation enabled the development of systematic approaches to gathering information about criminal network activities while maintaining operational security that protected sisterhood operations from retaliation. The intelligence gathering revealed that criminal organizations were indeed planning coordinated attacks against community protection efforts throughout Europe, using methods that combined direct intimidation with sophisticated propaganda campaigns designed to discredit grassroots organizing activities. The attacks were scheduled to coincide with expansion of exploitation operations into new territories where community protection networks had not yet been established. This intelligence enabled the sisterhood to warn their international partners about impending threats while developing coordinated defensive measures that could protect community organizations throughout Europe from systematic attack. The early warning systems that had originally been created to help individual artists avoid exploitation were adapted to serve entire networks of protective organizations that face similar dangers from organized criminal retaliation. The coordination efforts also revealed opportunities for offensive operations that could disrupt criminal planning while they were still in preparatory stages. Rather than simply defending against attacks after they began, community protection networks could work together to gather intelligence and coordinate with law enforcement agencies in ways that prevented criminal operations from achieving their objectives. Marie Dubois recognized that these offensive capabilities represented a fundamental shift in the relationship between community protection efforts and the criminal networks that sought to exploit vulnerable populations. The sisterhood was no longer simply providing defensive services that helped people avoid victimization. They were developing capabilities that could actively disrupt exploitation operations and reduce the overall threat environment for vulnerable communities. The shift from defensive to offensive operations required new types of expertise and resources that challenged the organization's commitment to maintaining grassroots authenticity while developing professional capabilities. The women had to learn intelligence gathering techniques, coordinate with law enforcement agencies, and manage complex operations that extended across national boundaries, all while preserving the community connections and mutual support principles that had enabled their original success. The challenge was complicated by the need to maintain strict operational security while building the trust and cooperation that effective intelligence work required. Law enforcement officials needed to have confidence in sisterhood capabilities and reliability. But providing too much information about community protection methods could compromise the security measures that protected ongoing operations from criminal retaliation. Louise Girard developed what she called graduated disclosure protocols that enabled the sharing of intelligence information according to carefully calibrated levels of trust and verification. Law enforcement partners received the information they needed to conduct effective investigations while remaining unaware of the specific methods and sources that had generated that intelligence. The protocols proved remarkably effective at building productive relationships with official agencies while maintaining the security that protected community operations. Police investigators received high-quality intelligence that enhanced their capabilities for disrupting criminal networks, while sisterhood operations remained protected from the infiltration attempts that often accompanied expanded law enforcement cooperation. The success of intelligence collaboration created opportunities for joint operations that could achieve results neither community organizations nor official agencies could accomplish independently. Criminal networks that had learned to evade traditional law enforcement methods found themselves confronting coordinated efforts that combined grassroots intelligence gathering with official investigative authorities. By the spring of 1929, these joint operations had achieved remarkable success in disrupting criminal networks throughout Paris and other major European cities. Multiple exploitation operations were shut down through coordinated raids that were based on intelligence gathered by community protection networks and executed by law enforcement agencies with appropriate legal authorities. But perhaps more importantly, the success of these operations demonstrated that community-based organizing could develop capabilities that complemented rather than competed with official institutions responsible for public safety and social protection. The women had proven that grassroots networks could become valuable partners in comprehensive approaches to addressing systematic exploitation and community vulnerability. The partnership model attracted attention from government agencies throughout Europe that were struggling with similar challenges related to protecting vulnerable populations from organized exploitation. Social service administrators, law enforcement officials, and policymakers began seeking consultation about adapting sisterhood methods to their own institutional contexts and community challenges. These consultation requests created new opportunities for expanding the impact of community protection principles while generating sustainable funding sources that could support continued operations and organizational development. Government contracts and institutional partnerships provided revenue streams that enabled professional staff development and resource acquisition without compromising the independence and community commitment that had made grassroots organizing effective. The integration of community organizing with institutional partnerships represented the culmination of the sisterhood's evolution from survival network to comprehensive social movement. The women had successfully demonstrated that grassroots initiatives could achieve sustainable impact by developing capabilities that served broader public interests while maintaining authentic connections to the vulnerable communities that had inspired their original efforts. Their success proved that effective responses to systematic exploitation required approaches that combined community-based intelligence gathering with official law enforcement capabilities, grassroots organizing with institutional resources, and local community knowledge with professional expertise in security and social protection. The teenage girls who had arrived in Paris seeking authentic artistic experience had become pioneers in community organizing and social protection, whose innovations were influencing approaches to vulnerability and exploitation throughout European society. Their journey from potential victims to leaders of international protective networks demonstrated that ordinary individuals could develop extraordinary capabilities when they possessed the courage to transform dangerous circumstances into opportunities for positive social change. As the decade concluded, the women who had survived the heroin epidemic through intelligence, cooperation, and unwavering commitment to community protection found themselves in positions they had never anticipated when they first began sharing information about suspicious activities in Parisian cafes. Their methods had become models for citizen engagement and social innovation that transcended the specific circumstances of their origins. the survival strategies that had enabled them to navigate criminal exploitation in Bohemian culture had evolved into comprehensive approaches to community empowerment that could benefit any population facing systematic threats to their safety, dignity, and independence. Their legacy would continue influencing social movements and protection efforts for generations, providing lasting evidence that the most effective responses to systematic exploitation emerged from the communities being targeted, when those communities possessed the knowledge, courage, and determination necessary to protect themselves while creating better alternatives for future generations. The winter of 1929 brought news that would validate everything the sisterhood had worked to achieve, while simultaneously revealing new challenges that would test their innovations in ways they had never imagined. Reports began arriving from their international network describing the complete collapse of criminal exploitation operations in multiple cities, as coordinated law enforcement efforts, supported by community intelligence, had systematically dismantled the networks that had terrorized artistic communities throughout Europe. But these victories came with the sobering realization that their success had attracted attention from forces far more powerful and sophisticated than the criminal organizations they had learned to combat. The methods they had developed for protecting vulnerable communities were now being studied by government agencies and social movements throughout the world, creating both unprecedented opportunities and entirely new categories of responsibility for the women who'd created these innovations through their determination to survive and protect others from the dangers they had successfully overcome. The attention from powerful institutions created a paradox that the women hadn't anticipated when they first began documenting suspicious patterns in Montparnasse cafes. Their grassroots innovations were being recognized as significant contributions to social protection theory, but this recognition came with pressures that threatened to transform their community-based approach into something they barely recognized. Academic researchers from prestigious universities across Europe began requesting access to their methods for scholarly analysis and publication. Government ministries wanted to standardize their techniques for implementation in official social service programs. International organizations sought to package their innovations into training curricula that could be distributed globally to address similar challenges in different cultural contexts. Each of these opportunities represented potential resources and expanded impact that could benefit countless vulnerable communities. But they also represented fundamental alterations to the authentic relationships and grassroots principles that had made their original work effective. The women found themselves caught between their desire to share protective knowledge with others who needed it, and their recognition that institutionalization could destroy the very qualities that made their methods successful. Marie Dubois struggled with this tension as she reviewed yet another request from a prominent sociology department seeking to conduct comprehensive studies of sisterhood organizational methods. The researchers offered substantial compensation and promised that their findings would enhance understanding of community organizing principles among scholars and policymakers throughout Europe. But Marie's artist's instincts warned her that academic analysis might reduce their living, breathing community relationships to abstract theoretical concepts that missed the essential human elements enabling their success. The subtle interactions, intuitive responses, and emotional connections that allowed them to recognize danger and build protective relationships couldn't be captured in scholarly papers or replicated through bureaucratic procedures. Louise Girard faced similar dilemmas as social service agencies requested detailed protocols for implementing extraction techniques within official institutional frameworks. Her medical training appreciated the potential benefits of sharing therapeutic approaches that had proven effective with manipulation victims. But her community organizing experience recognized that institutional contexts might strip away the trust and authenticity necessary for successful interventions. The healing relationships she had developed with former exploitation victims were based on personal commitment and shared vulnerability that couldn't be mandated through official procedures or professional training programs. The emotional safety that enabled people to confront their manipulation experiences emerged from genuine community connections, rather than institutional service delivery systems. Isabel Moreau encountered the most complex challenges as government intelligence agencies sought to incorporate sisterhood surveillance methods into official security operations. Her journalistic background made her acutely aware of how intelligence gathering could be misused when separated from the community protection purposes that had originally justified these activities. The techniques they had developed for monitoring criminal networks were designed to protect vulnerable populations from exploitation, not to provide surveillance capabilities that could be used against legitimate social movements or political dissidents. But government agencies weren't necessarily interested in maintaining these ethical boundaries. If sisterhood methods could enhance their capabilities for monitoring activities they considered potentially threatening to political stability, these institutional pressures forced the women to develop new approaches to sharing their knowledge that could maximize beneficial impact while preserving the community authenticity that made their methods effective. They needed ways to teach protective principles without compromising the relationships and values that had enabled their development. The solution they devised reflected the same innovative thinking that had characterized their entire evolution from survival network to comprehensive social movement. Rather than allowing others to study and package their methods, they would create their own educational initiatives that could share protective knowledge while maintaining community control over how that knowledge was applied. Marie proposed establishing what she called community teaching centers that would provide direct training in protective methods while ensuring that participants understood and committed to the ethical principles underlying these techniques. Rather than abstract academic study or bureaucratic implementation, the centers would offer experiential learning that emphasized relationship building and community connection as essential elements of effective protection work. The community teaching approach required participants to spend extended periods working directly with vulnerable populations before gaining access to advanced protective techniques. This experiential requirement ensured that protective knowledge would be applied within authentic community relationships, rather than extracted for use in contexts that might compromise its effectiveness or ethical integrity. Louise developed therapeutic training programs that taught extraction and healing techniques within comprehensive frameworks, emphasizing mutual support and community accountability. Rather than producing professional service providers who would work within institutional hierarchies, the programs created networks of community healers who remained connected to grassroots organizing principles while developing specialized capabilities for helping exploitation victims. The therapeutic training emphasized that effective healing required ongoing relationships with supportive communities, rather than isolated professional interventions. Participants learned to facilitate recovery processes that strengthened community connections while addressing individual trauma, creating multiplier effects that enhanced protective capabilities throughout entire networks, rather than just individual service recipients. Isabel created intelligence training that taught surveillance and analysis methods within strict ethical frameworks that prioritize community protection over institutional advantage. Participants learned to gather information about threats to vulnerable populations while maintaining accountability to the communities they served, rather than external authorities who might have different priorities. The intelligence training emphasized that information gathering was only legitimate when it served community protection purposes and remained under community control. Participants committed to using surveillance capabilities exclusively for defensive purposes that protected vulnerable populations from exploitation rather than offensive operations that might compromise civil liberties or democratic principles. These community-controlled educational initiatives attracted participants from throughout Europe who were genuinely committed to community protection rather than institutional advancement or academic research. The experiential requirements and ethical frameworks excluded individuals who might have been interested in extracting protective techniques for purposes that weren't aligned with sisterhood values. The educational programs also created new revenue streams that could support continued operations while maintaining independence from government funding or institutional partnerships that might compromise organizational autonomy. Training fees and consultation contracts provided sustainable financing that enabled professional staff development without dependence on external authorities who might seek to influence operational decisions. But perhaps most importantly, the educational initiatives enabled the sisterhood to expand their protective impact while maintaining direct control over how their innovations were shared and applied, rather than allowing others to interpret and implement their methods according to different priorities. They could ensure that protective knowledge remained connected to community organizing principles and ethical frameworks that had guided their development. The community teaching centers attracted international attention from social movements and grassroots organizations that were struggling with similar challenges related to protecting vulnerable populations. From systematic exploitation, delegations began arriving from other countries to participate in training programs and explore possibilities for adapting sisterhood methods to different cultural and political contexts. These international exchanges revealed that criminal exploitation of vulnerable populations was indeed a global phenomenon that required coordinated responses, transcending national boundaries. Women's organizations from Africa, Asia, and the Americas reported facing identical manipulation techniques and organizational challenges, suggesting that criminal networks were sharing methods internationally just as community protection efforts needed to share defensive knowledge. The recognition that exploitation techniques were being coordinated globally led to expansion of the international sisterhood network into a comprehensive resource sharing system that could provide mutual support for community protection efforts worldwide. The network enabled rapid dissemination of information about new threats and innovative protective responses, creating early warning systems that could help communities prepare for exploitation attempts before they became established. The global network also facilitated resource sharing that could assist community organizations facing challenges that exceeded their local capabilities. When criminal networks targeted protection efforts in one region, partner organizations from other areas could provide financial support, technical assistance, or temporary safe havens that helped maintain operations during crisis periods. By the autumn of 1930, the sisterhood had evolved into something unprecedented in the history of social movements, a grassroots organization that had successfully maintained community authenticity while developing global reach and institutional recognition. Their innovations were influencing community protection efforts throughout the world while remaining rooted in the authentic relationships and mutual support principles that had enabled their original survival. The transformation demonstrated that grassroots organizing could achieve sustainable international impact without sacrificing the community connections and ethical commitments that made local work effective. The women had learned to navigate complex relationships with powerful institutions while preserving their independence and commitment to serving vulnerable populations, according to principles they had developed through years of community organizing. Their success proved that effective responses to systematic exploitation required approaches that combined local community knowledge with global coordination, grassroots authenticity with professional capabilities, and defensive protection with strategic intervention. The survival strategies that had enabled them to navigate the heroin epidemic had evolved into comprehensive frameworks for community empowerment that could benefit any population facing systematic threats to their safety and dignity. The teenage girls who had arrived in Paris seeking authentic artistic experiences had become pioneers in global social protection, whose innovations were establishing new standards for community organizing and international cooperation. Their journey from potential victims to leaders of worldwide protective networks demonstrated that ordinary individuals could develop extraordinary capabilities when they possessed the courage to transform dangerous circumstances into opportunities for positive social change. As the new decade began, the women who had survived through intelligence, cooperation, and unwavering commitment to community protection found themselves facing challenges and opportunities that would have been unimaginable when they first began sharing warnings about suspicious activities in Bohemian cafes. Their methods had become models for social innovation that were being studied and adapted throughout the world, creating both unprecedented possibilities for positive impact and entirely new categories of responsibility for the communities they served. The survival techniques that had enabled them to protect artistic communities from criminal exploitation had evolved into universal principles for community empowerment that could address systematic threats in any context where vulnerable populations faced organized manipulation. Their legacy was becoming a living resource for social movements and protection efforts worldwide, providing evidence that the most effective responses to exploitation emerged from the communities being targeted when those communities possessed the knowledge, courage, and determination necessary to create alternatives that served human flourishing rather than individual profit or institutional control. The women who had learned to read subtle signs of danger in smoke-filled cafes had become masters of recognizing and responding to systematic threats that most people couldn't perceive. Their expertise in building protective relationships and creating alternative institutions was transforming how vulnerable communities throughout the world understood their own capabilities for collective self-defense and mutual support. But their greatest achievement remained the demonstration that survival strategies could evolve into comprehensive approaches to social change that benefited entire populations rather than just individual participants. The protection methods they had developed were continuing to serve as tools for community empowerment that enabled ordinary people to resist systematic exploitation, while building the supportive relationships and alternative institutions necessary for human dignity and creative fulfillment in increasingly complex and challenging social environments. The story of their remarkable transformation would continue inspiring future generations of community organizers and social innovators, providing lasting evidence that extraordinary change could emerge from the determination of ordinary individuals to protect themselves and others from forces that sought to exploit human vulnerability for destructive purposes. Their legacy would endure as a testament to the power of collective action based on mutual support, shared commitment to community welfare, and unwavering dedication to creating alternatives that served the highest human possibilities rather than the lowest common denominators of fear, greed, and manipulation. The story of these remarkable women offers us something far more valuable than just a historical curiosity about surviving a forgotten epidemic. Their journey from vulnerable newcomers to architects of international protection networks reveals timeless principles about human resilience and community power that remain just as relevant today as they were in those smoky Parisian cafes nearly a century ago. What makes their achievement truly extraordinary isn't just that they survived when so many others didn't. It's that they transformed their survival into a form of social innovation that protected countless others while preserving the very cultural values and creative aspirations that had drawn them to Paris in the first place. They proved that the most effective responses to systematic exploitation don't come from authorities or institutions, but from the communities being targeted when those communities possess the courage to organize, the intelligence to understand their adversaries, and the determination to create better alternatives. The techniques they developed, reading social environments, building protective relationships, creating alternative institutions, and sharing knowledge through authentic community connections, remain as powerful today as they were then. In our own era of sophisticated manipulation and systematic exploitation, their methods offer practical tools for recognizing danger, building resilience, and creating the kinds of supportive communities that enable human flourishing rather than individual destruction. Perhaps their most important lesson is that survival itself can become a creative act when it's grounded in mutual support and shared commitment to protecting others from similar dangers. These women discovered that their greatest strength lay not in avoiding threats, but in transforming their understanding of those threats into resources that could benefit entire communities for generations to come.